A large number of you might perceive the name Hun from the last realm, where he is painted as a finesse and self-serving Viking. Yet the genuine story of Hun is far more amazing, carved into the records of history as the adventure of a fighter whose desire and ability exceeded all rational limitations. Hun was one of the best and scandalous Vikings ever, and was definitely more impressive than his depiction in the last realm. Albeit the two really do share a few qualities. Hun's life was an embroidery of triumph and trying endeavors closed by the powerful. Björn Ironside, he directed an armada that struck dread across the Mediterranean in the place where there is the Franks. Hun procured a wild and notoriety. In one such severe fight, Hun's Viking crowd struck down the brave Robert the Solid, an observed champion, who might turn into the precursor of the Lord of the Franks, perpetually establishing Hun's legend. Yet his adventure didn't end there. The shores of Britain anticipated his appearance, where he would meet his match as Alfred the Incomparable, the respectable Lord of Wessex. Hun would encounter his most imposing enemy. The two would conflict and fight their wills, secured in a savage challenge of technique and strength. In time they would parlay, each attempting to outsmart the other. Yet in the end, it was Hun's foul play that would radiate through as he broke his assertion to Alfred, realizing that the outcome would mean conflict as the years wore on and the fire of his childhood started to wane. Hun was portrayed as a vigorous and unnerving old hero, a man who had outlasted innumerable adversaries, yet whose fearsome soul had never diminished. He was one of the most famous Vikings, ever having attacked many urban areas across numerous realms in Europe, the Mediterranean, and North Africa, explored the oceans of a large portion of the explored parts of the planet during his time, and being the veteran of 100 fights. This is his story. Melon Television is a narrative web-based feature made by movie producers, offering one of the most extravagant assortments of verifiable substance, with more than 4,000 narratives covering history, nature, genuine wrongdoing, workmanship, culture, and significantly more. By and by, I've been watching Old Heroes, an entrancing series about unbelievable battling societies. Episode 11 spotlights on the Vikings, giving a top-to-bottom investigate the Viking Age, as well as their ascent, downpour, and inevitable downfall. The show investigates different hero social orders, including the Kel Assyrians and Normans, along with a lot more, and is ideal for history buffs like me anxious to study old fighter societies. Melon Television has turned into a staple of my vacation routine. Contribution: an extraordinary departure during calm winter evenings. Watching old fighters has been completely pleasant, particularly as I'm ready to investigate the inspirations of old troopers and how they resided, battled, prepared, passed on, and influenced the world. This gave me further knowledge into the present subject of the Viking legend. Hun History Profile watchers get their most memorable month for only 99 pennies, or appreciate half off a whole year. Don't stand by. Click the connection in the portrayal to jump into the universe of astounding narratives on Melon Television. The early existence of Hun remains covered in secret, with not many records to enlighten his starting points. The Saxon account recognizes him basically as a Dane, offering minimal more than this short reference to his legacy. Anyway, a more baffling record is introduced by the 11th century writer Roald Glaber, who recommends that Hun may have been brought into the world in the terrains of Petit, in what is currently cutting-edge France. This case, however, captivating stands as opposed to different sources that plainly imprint him as a Scandinavian antiquarian. Michael Diane proposes a potential compromise of these clashing records. In around the year 800, sovereign Charlemagne, in his endeavors to subdue disobedience in Saxony, migrated numerous Saxons and Danes to Christian grounds. It is possible that Hun was brought into the world in the mid-9th 100 years to one of these uprooted families brought up in an unfamiliar land. He might have later revealed his Scandinavian roots, maybe through family regulation or genealogical disuse, which would have provoked his possible revisitation of the North. There he would ascend to conspicuousness, in the end turning into a boat chief and a head of Viking champions. Another hypothesis is that Hun might have been a child of the unbelievable Ragnar Lothbrok, making him a sibling to the considerable Björn Ironside. Yet this stays impossible. A case may be made by Hun himself to acquire distinction in the Viking scene, on the other hand, his actual guardians might have essentially been lost to the desolates of time, always darkened in the obscurity of history. Subsequently, the starting points of Hun stay a secret, with contending hypotheses offering looks into the past, yet none giving an authoritative response whether brought into the world among the Saxons, the Danes, or the bloodline of Ragnar. There is hypothesis that Hun was brought into the world in around the year 810, and he is acknowledged for being engaged with different attacks on the Frankish realm. His ascent to popularity in the Viking scene anyway started in the year 859, where Hun mutually drove an undertaking with Björn inside various Frankish, Norman, Middle Easterners, Scandinavian, and Irish sources. Notice a huge Viking assault into the Mediterranean in the years 859 to 861, co-drove by Hun and Björn Ironside. William of Geer, a priest brought into the world in the year 1000, offers an entrancing look into the inspirations driving this excellent endeavor. As per William, Hun imagined a striking plan to put Björn Ironside upon the privileged position of the Roman domain, turning into a leader of the terrains of the Mediterranean. Together, they fashioned an arrangement to attack the shorelines of the Old World, carrying both wealth and magnificence to the Viking swarm. It was an arrangement that would end up being, however, trying as it seemed to be hazardous, and one that would make plans to arrive at an amazing effort. The Vikings set forth from the Law, the longest stream in France, on board an imposing armada of 62 ships, every one quick and dangerous. The winged serpent-headed long ships were intended for both speed and mobility, and were great for assaults upon far-off shores, empowering the Vikings to strike rapidly. Their most memorable objective was the Iberian promontory, where the Vikings exploited the overall shortcoming of the Christian realms and the continuous struggle between the neighborhood rulers and the Muslim Saracen. In the year 859, the realm of Ayores, situated in what is presently northern Spain, was governed by Lord Ordano, I initial a ruler entangled in tenacious conflict against the Saracens. These Muslim trespassers had cleared across the Iberian promontory since the year 711, resulting in obliteration afterward, as they laid out a strong Islamic express that extended across a lot of Spain. As the Vikings arrived on the bank of Azores, they were met with little opposition and immediately set about striking the district. Anyway, their underlying achievement was met with a test. The nearby Christian powers drove by Count where Pedro of Azores accumulated their solidarity, sent off a counterattack, overcoming the Vikings. In a horrendous clash, in spite of experiencing weighty misfortunes, Hun and Björn were unflinching. They turned their concentration towards the Saracens themselves, attacking their fortresses and participating in a progression of ridiculous encounters and attacks. Quite possibly of the most sublime and bold assault on their mission occurred in the Emirate of Cordoba, a strong Bedouin Islamic express that controlled a lot of southern Spain. In a momentous presentation of their battling ability, Hun and Björn blockaded the city of Bruges, a significant port on the southern tip of the Iberian promontory. For 3 days they laid attack to the city, their powers overpowering the safeguards. After ultimately taking the city, they stole from the homes of the rich in a demonstration of unadulterated disobedience. Actually loving the Norse lords of old, the Vikings put a match to the mosques in the city. With their attack currently complete, they amassed incredible abundance in gold, silver, and slaves products they would later sell or use to fuel their continuous Mediterranean mission. Encouraged by their prosperity, Hun and Björn turned their sights toward the south, wandering across the thin Strait of Jaw to strike at the core of North Africa. The Vikings cruised to the shoreline of advanced Morocco and Algeria, where they focused on the Idrisid line, a Muslim realm managed by the relatives of the Prophet Muhammad. The Vikings assaulted seaside urban areas, stealing from them for fortune and taking detainees who might later be sold into bondage. The assaults against the Saracens went on with decimating effectiveness. Hun and BJ's armada struck dread into the hearts of the Muslim rulers, pillaging urban communities along the shoreline of what is presently Tunisia and Algeria. Their frenzy proceeded with toward the east to the Big Islands, where they destroyed to the islands of Majorca and Minorca. and further toward the eastern Mediterranean, where they held onto the waterfront town of Arella. The mission additionally took them to the town of Neol, where they laid out a brief base and held the town for a time of 8 days. During this time, they further solidified their standing as merciless marauders holding on to abundance and slaves, while striking trepidation into the hearts of the neighborhood people. The following targets were the rich urban areas in southern France, where they married destruction, stealing from fortunes and taking detainees anyway. The Vikings would before long head out towards Italy in their determined quest for abundance, brilliance, and timeless eminence. Björn Ironside and the shrewdness Hun set forth along the rough Italian shoreline, their eyes were fixed on Luni, a town that with its disintegrating ruins and pompous engineering had once been a guide of influence and wonder to the Viking looters. Anyway, its rotting stone, yet again, walls and transcending landmarks held a commitment more noteworthy than simple wealth. They accepted that they had found the famous city of Rome itself, the core of the old world. The town, a middle for marble mining thriving, had long since a long time ago lost its significance, now a calm town of stone and residue, with just the slightest reverberations of its past glory. Hun, ever the specialist, realized that savage power alone wouldn't win the day he could see the monumental walls of the town, and perceived that a front-facing attack would be vain. Rather, he formulated an arrangement so wicked and clever that it would go down in the chronicles of Viking legend. He realized that town's strict energy would be their shortcoming, assuming some pretense of a perishing man looking for reclamation. Hunt requested his men to convey him to the town doors on a cot. His body pretended to be very nearly demise. The divine beings permitted the entry, and word immediately spread that the Viking warlord looked to embrace Christianity before his last breath, and moved by the confidence in recovery. The town's kin guided him into the congregation. One side, Hun was introduced to the hallowed freedoms of the Christian confidence, getting the ceremonies according to the town's ministry. Yet this was no modest man looking for salvation in a snapshot of heavenly joke. Hun jumped from his cart. He revitalized his men, and quickly they dropped upon Looney like wolves upon a group of sheep. The town was sacked in a craze of viciousness. Wealth were taken, homes were copied, and the once glad church was tainted. Another record guarantees that Hun's stratagem was significantly more intricate, guaranteeing that he would embrace Christianity on his deathbed, just a fiend. Passing the next day, the townspeople, tricked by his misrepresentation, permitted him and 50 of his men hung in robes to enter the congregation for his alleged entombment. Yet as the memorial service privileges started, Hun sprang from his casket, his sword blazing through the air, and with a solitary quick strike, he executed the minister, sending shock floods of dread all through the town in a ruthless snapshot of when the Viking thieves released their rage upon Looney, firing the city and its fortunes. Yet the narrative of this strike goes off in a strange direction as Hun remained in the midst of the tumult, asserting triumph over the strong Rome. The town's kin rectified him. The city he had vanquished was not Rome, it was Looney, a sad remnant of the domain he looked to. Guaranteed, maddened by this embarrassment, Hun's anger ejected, he requested the butcher of each and every male occupant, and the catch of numerous ladies and youngsters who had turned into his slaves. His triumph, once magnificent, turned into a story of severe retribution. The Vikings would then cruise along the Italian coast. They put their sights on the city of Pisa, where their long ships wreaked destruction upon the city's walls, and they would start to loot it anyway as the armada advanced back to the lunar destiny. Questioned them, a horrible blow, a rough tempest tore through the Viking armada, and they had to leave almost 40 of their boats to the ocean's leniency. 2 additional vessels were lost on the waterways of Jalar. In spite of this, Hun pushed on his armada, battered yet imposing, and he would direct his concentration toward the city of Plona. There the Vikings struck again, assaulting the city with unnerving accuracy. Hun would try and catch their lord Garcia Inns of Pamplona, holding him hostage for a weighty payment. The cost for the ruler's delivery was 70,000 gold dinars, a coin of huge worth in the archaic Islam world, with their money chests overflowing with gold slaves and crown jewels of war. Hun and his champions advanced home the wealth they aggregated. and their deeds in unfamiliar faraway grounds would turn into the stuff of legend. Yet this wasn't the end for Hun in the portentous year of 866. A groundbreaking partnership was produced between Solomon, the Duke of Brittany, and the Viking commandant Hun. Their consolidated powers set out on an aggressive undertaking. As the Viking swarm cleared across the western coast, they plummeted upon the city of Lar arranged in the northwest of France. Lamar, once a dynamic city, was sacked, its abundance and wonder tumbling to the desire of Hun, a man that had struck endless urban areas. Anyway, the demolition of Lamar didn't be ignored. Robert the Solid, a courageous commandant of the Frankish powers, who had long protected the northern locales of Francia, adapted to the situation with a military collected from the encompassing terrains. Robert looked to repulse the Viking scourge that took steps to enclose his realm. He drove his soldiers with steel up in the air to oust the marauders from the rich grounds of western Francia. This would bring about the clash of imp. In this fight, the Frankish armed force prevailed with regards to blocking the Danes before they could withdraw to the well-being of their boat. The Vikings, understanding the tide of fight was going, endeavored to look for shelter in a close-by chapel, trusting the walls of the sacred spot would protect them from the wrath of the Frankish powers. Yet Robert the Solid, ever not set in stone to end the Viking danger, unequivocally, he requested an attack of the congregation surrounding the structure and removing the trespasser departure. Caught inside the congregation, the Viking commandant wound up in a hazardous situation with no unmistakable getaway course. Yet in the mayhem of the attack, Hun's genius radiated through as Robert eliminated his shield to more readily supervise the attack. The Vikings, in an unexpected and surprising move, sent off a wild counterattack. The Franks were surprised. In the resulting scuffle, Robert the Solid was struck down during the most intense part of the conflict. His life smothered the deficiency of their chief, tossed the Frankish powers into chaos. With their commandant dead and their spirit broke, the Franks had no real option except to withdraw. Leaving the Vikings successful. Encouraged by this achievement, Hun and his heroes kept on desolating a few pieces of Francia for the majority more years. Yet regardless of the proceeding with wave of Viking victory, a delicate harmony settled over the district. The persevering pattern of slaughter and ravaging eased back, and for a short time frame the Viking powers pulled out, yet harmony as consistently ended up being momentary. The Frankish Lord Charles the Bald, dreading the deficiency of more domain, prepared his powers. Hun, ever the carefully prepared Viking commandant, pursued a game-changing choice. Perceiving the moving tides of influence in Francia, and realizing that his territory was as of now not secure, he turned his look across the oceans towards the place that is known for Britain. It was there, in the midst of the disturbance and hardship of a cracked realm, that Hun and his fighters saw the commitment of wealth and loot past creative mind. The legend of Britain, with its tremendous riches and unguarded shores, turned into another reference point for Hun's aspirations. In the year 892, Hun set out upon an aggressive camp mission to attack Britain, crossing the Channel from B with one of two extraordinary Viking armadas. Driving the more modest of the two, his powers numbering 80 boats, arrived on the shores of Kent, possessing the illustrious town of Milton Regis close to sitting. Conceived his partners with a lot bigger armada of 250 boats, landed at Appledore. Yet Britain, once a broke land, had been joined under the administration of Alfred the Incomparable. At this point, Wessex had ascended to turn into the predominant realm in the English Isles, and Alfred, having effectively joined the realms of Northumbria and East Anglia under his overlordship, stood fearless with regards to his domain. As the Viking armed forces infringed upon the southern shores, Alfred quickly assembled his powers. He situated his military decisively between Eston's more modest organization and the bigger Viking power, successfully keeping them from uniting. Accordingly, Hun, ever the practical person, looked to keep away from an all-out struggle and subsequently consented to grapple with Alfred. One of these circumstances was the submersion of his two children, a representative demonstration of harmony. With these terms set up, Hun pulled out from Kent, moving his powers to Essex. Yet the harmony wouldn't last. The bigger Viking armed force, having attacked Hampshire and Berkshire, looked to rejoin with Hun anyway. Their endeavors were thread as they were definitively crushed at the skirmish of Fearsome by a military drove by Edward Alfred's child. The survivors battered, however, not broken, ultimately advanced toward Benevolence Island. In Essex, where they rejoined with Hun's powers, a consolidated multitude of Wessex and Mercian warriors would before long send off an attack against the fort Hun had laid out at Benfleet in Essex. The Viking fortification, created with Hun's extensive financial stability and shrewd, was viewed as invulnerable. Its strong walls and very much sustained guards withstood the steady endeavors of the unified powers. The Vikings protected in the fort walls proceeded with their strikes in Mercia from this base. Yet notwithstanding the strength of his fort, Hun's hang-on Essex was not totally secure, while his primary powers were out assaulting those abandoned in the post, were overpowered by the milias of eastern Wessex. Reinforced by Alfred's soldiers, the whole fort was, in the end, lost alongside the groups of the Viking pillagers, including Hun's own better half and kids, who were caught alongside their boats. It was a staggering yet again catastrophe for the Viking chief, yet Hun was not one to give up effectively. He quickly refocused, migrating his powers to eastern Essex, where he started building another post. He additionally called for fortifications from the Danish realms of East Anglia and York, supporting his positions in anticipation of additional contention. The circumstance grew much more tense as the Vikings looked to recapture their lost ground and get payback for the loss they had experienced. Amidst this battle, Hun tried to haggle with Alfred. As per the somewhat English-Saxon narrative, Hun and Alfred held chats fully intent on getting the arrival of his family. The result of the discussions ended up being critical defining moment. Hun's two children, who had been submerged before that year, were gotten back to him as an indication of kindness. The sanctifications had been a vital piece of an earlier exchange, with ruler Alfred and Ethelred, the master of the Mercians, going about as guardians to the young men anyway. Despite the fact that Hun's children were currently Christian, that wouldn't prevent him from chasing after additional land and more abundance. Subsequently, the stage was set for the continuation of the battle between the powers of West and the Viking bandits. Hun's mission for abundance, influence, and brilliance in Britain would proceed with the talks among Hun and Alfred. The incomparable at last yielded little for the realms of Wessex and Mercia, for Hun would break his statement not long after the non-aggression treaty. Hun, ever tireless in his interest for abundance, sent off a second wrecking attack across Britain. His powers first previously desolated the Thames Valley, then, at that point, cleared toward the west along the waterway. 7. The Viking surge was met with quick counter as Ede, ruler of the Mercians, energized a consolidated multitude of Wessex Mercia, and, surprisingly, the champions from the Welsh realms. This considerable power sought after the Danes and caught them at a spot called Buddington. This would bring about the skirmish of Buddington. The old English-Saxon narrative relates the urgency of the Viking safeguards, expressing after numerous weeks had passed, a portion of the barbarians passed on from hunger, yet some having by then eaten their ponies, broke out of the fort and got fight together with the people who were on the east bank of the waterway. In the following turmoil, the Vikings battled courageously, yet the Christians, Wessex, and Welsh powers arose triumphant. A huge number of Viking heroes fell in fight, and a lot more were put to flight. Hun, anyway, was not among the fallen. In that frame of mind of the butcher, he figured out how to get away from the slaughter and pull out toward the east. There, he found shelter in the demolished Roman fort at Chester, situated in East Anglia, constantly 893, still up in the air. To modify the fortresses and utilize this site as a base for additional attacks into northern Mercia. Yet the Mercians, as yet faltering from the Viking danger, were undaunted. With all due respect, they laid attack to the fort, trimming off Hun's provisions and obliterating the locale's harvests and animals, expecting to starve the Vikings into accommodation. Unfit to keep up with their position, Hun's powers deserted Chester and crossed into North Ribs. Anyway, their circumstance became progressively desperate as they wound up, denied of their ravaged cows and grain. Turning around towards Northumbria, they tried to dodge their followers. Following a few days of avoiding the English powers, they in the end showed up at Leniency, an island off the eastern shore of Essex, where they laid out another base. Before long, the Viking thieves proceeded with their mission, plundering and looting the southern provinces. Their brutality attacks in the end carried them into struggle with individuals of Chichester, who mounted a protection against the pirates, putting them to flight and killing a large number of them. The English powers additionally caught a few of the Danes' boats, adding one more disaster for Hun's now extended assets. In spite of these mishaps, Hun's powers proceeded with their tenacious mission, climbing the Thames in the waterway, trying to restore their predominance in the mid-year of the year 894. The Vikings sustained their situation along the Lee, developing a fort approximately 20 mi from London, expression of their new fortifications spread rapidly, and soon an enormous power of townsmen and troopers accumulated to stand up to the trespassers. Yet by and by the Vikings demonstrated their mettle, putting the English powers to flight and killing 4 of the lords ths in the process. In spite of this triumph, Hun and his men stayed powerless against the could of the English. Understanding the trickiness of their position, Alfred the Incomparable contrived a shrewd technique to hinder the Vikings across the stream. He requested the development of 2 forts on one or the other side of the Lee, successfully fixing the Vikings in. When the Danes acknowledged they could never again get to the stream or their boats, they deserted the fort and endeavored to escape anyway. The English powers were close behind, and the Vikings were in the end compelled to withdraw to Scaffold North by the Severn, where they built one more fort. Regardless of their proceeded with opposition, they were presently obviously on edge, as the colder time of year of the 894 set in. The Viking armed force got comfortable extension north, their developments confined by the persevering English tension, and continuously 896. With their choices waning, the Viking marauders started to distribute a good advance toward East Anglia, while others ventured toward the north to Northumbria. Those without means to proceed with the battle found transports and cruised south, leaving Britain for a period. Consequently, the once powerful Viking force that had taken steps to crack the actual underpinning of the English realm at last missed the mark concerning its objective. Hun's military, once a considerable danger, in the end spread and blurred into lack of clarity. By around the year 896, Hun, now an old man, vanished from the pages of history, having proactively procured a standing as the vigorous and unnerving old fighter of the Somme. He carried on with a day-to-day existence, loaded up with struggle, victory, and carnage. However, his name would reverberate in the stories of the adventures. The destiny of Hun remains covered in secret. His last years unrecorded, his end uncelebrated, cut his name into the world's memory as one of the most famous and fruitful Vikings ever. He assaulted urban communities and realms across Europe, from the shores of France to the terrains of North Africa. Anyway, his legend was not one without discussion. The peered priest Duavis T. Quentin offered a scorching evaluation of the one who had once told armed forces that struck trepidation into the hearts of rulers and aristocrats. The same, he said, this was a man, a reviled, furious, powerfully horrible, and savage, pestilent, threatening, serious, given to shock and conniving, impolite, whimsical, and untamed, passing, managing, prolific in res, warmonger, general swindler, fermenter of underhanded, and a twofold kick the bucket dissimulator. Hun was seen through D's eyes as an on-figure viciousness and unfairness, an expert of trickery and disturbance, while it is conceivable that he was a man in his 70s or 80s. When he passed on, a man of his age and eminence could never have been an oddity in the Viking scene contemporary. For example, Rollo, and the Viking who might later turn into the pioneer behind the die of Normandy, and ruler Harold Fairhair, the main lord of Norway, likewise carried on with equivalently long resides. Hun's perseverance on the front line, joined with his capacity to explore hazardous political and military scenes of his time, proposes a man who was surprisingly effective in his quest for riches and influence. However, Hun was never a ruler, nor did he prevail in his definitive objective of enslaving the realms inside Britain. His name resided on as an image of the Viking lifestyle. His adventures motivated endless stories, melodies, and adventures deifying his deeds in the aggregate memory of the Viking scene. He carried on with the genuine Viking life, assaulting, ravaging, and driving various campaigns across the oceans. Despite the fact that time might have blurred the subtleties of his last years, his unbelievable adventures in jail and Hun will continuously be recognized as one of the best, though failed to remember Vikings to at any point cruise the oceans. I want to believe that all of you partook in the video on the off chance that you made certain to like, buy in, and offer, and I'll see you all soon for another set of experiences profile.